Welcome to this video about the vocabulary used in steel. To start with, a steel beam is what it is. It is basically a beam made out of steel. You might come across an RSJ, and RSJ stands for Reinforced Steel Joist, which is the old name for steel beams. It's quite easy to spot the difference because an RSJ does not have the top edge of the flange and the bottom edge of the flange parallel to each other, unlike a UC or UB section in today's steel sections. Steelwork is basically any structure that is made out of steel, so anything to do with steel you can be referred to as steelwork. Now there are some typical steel sections, so like you can see here, UC is a universal column, a UB is a universal beam. Difference between the UC and the UB is that a UC, the height of it and the width are almost the same, whereas a UB is quite narrow but quite deep. A PFC is a channel, so it's like a C section. RHS, SHS and CHS, they are all hollow sections. First one is a rectangle, second one is a square, and the third one is a round circular hollow section. Next we have flat sections, and it's predominantly out of flat sections that we prepare the fittings, so all the plates with holes that get welded to the ends of steel beams. And also angle sections, they are called professionally RSAs, which stands for rolled steel angles, and the first group is it has its legs equal. The other one has its legs unequal, so one is shorter than the other. When it comes to the names of the parts of steel beams, then both in UBs and UCs, and actually in PFCs as well, we use the word flange and web. And probably to simplify, any vertical part of these three beams is called the web, and all the horizontal parts are called the flanges. When it comes to the hollow sections, they have a wall, and the thickness of the wall is described by the name of the section. Now you might think, why are UK beams, why do they have like funny names? There's like a 152 UC23, a 203 UC46, and so on and so on. And actually the explanation is very easy. A 152 is nothing else than a 6-inch beam, and like you can see, a 203 is an 8-inch beam, 10 inches obviously 254 meters, and so on. When it comes to the coatings, the most often coating that you'll come across is basically a primer. So the beam is primed, and this is normally a zinc phosphate kind of paint that gets applied to the raw surface of the steel beam. Other coatings that you might come across are bituminous paint, which is basically a thick black paint that provides very good resistance to water. Next is galvanized steel, which is done through hot dipping into baths with zinc, and they are very shiny and they look quite nice when they come back from the galvanizers, and this kind of coating is always used when the steel work is exposed to the weather. The next coating, actually there's no coating, and that's why it's called either self-color or none, so no coat. And the last one is fire resistant paint, which is called an intermittent paint. Normally it's white, it is quite often water based, and it should be applied on site once the steel work is erected, because you can easily scratch it, and then obviously it won't be fire resistant anymore. A Westock beam is a beam made by a company called Westock, and they've patented their beams, so basically they have these massive holes, and the way they're made is actually it is a smaller beam, but then a laser cuts the web in such a way that when you put one part on top of the other and then shift it slightly to one side, you end up with these kind of shapes where you have a nice hole in the middle of the beam, and you obviously use them to save weight, but then also increase the depth of the beam, which obviously increases the strength capacity. UKC and UKB sections are very heavy UC and UB sections made by Corus or Tata. They have been patented and they are basically very, very thick. So they are also quite difficult to get hold of. So when you find them in a quote or in your drawings, always ask the structural engineer whether this could be replaced by an alternative normal UC or UB section. Shot blast and primed means that this beam has gone through a machine that first shot blasted, so it uses small tiny particles shot at the steel beam at very high speed, so it basically gets rid of anything from the surface of the beam. And in the same machine, but at the other end, it is primed. Normally it is applied by spraying primer onto the steel beam, and then it comes out of the machine very nice because it's smooth and the paint is very fresh, so it's nice and shiny. Stainless steel, and on drawings you might see the abbreviation ST/STL. That is basically steel that is stainless, so it has various grades, but basically it doesn't rust as easily as mild steel, and also the natural finish is very silver looking. A spreader is a steel plate that's role is to spread the load of a steel beam. So normally a spreader lies on top of a wall, and on top of the spreader we lay a beam. Therefore the weight that the beam carries is spread by the spreader onto the wall. Normally it is a very thick plate. Quite often it is one chunk of steel, whereas here on the photo you can see a spreader made out of 3 different thinner plates. A needle is a short steel beam, normally up to 2 meters long, and it is used to put across walls to temporarily support them when removing the wall below it. So you first install the needles, then you knock out the wall, next you install the steelwork under the needles, and then pack up the distance between the new beam and the old wall. And once that's already been packed up, you then get rid of the needles and then fill out the holes between the new steel beam and the old existing wall. To support the needles we need Acrow props. They are actually props, but Acrow is the name of the company that introduced props into the UK. A bolt is basically a bolt, probably not much to say about that. A washer is a thin, normally circular plate with a hole, and a nut is what you screw onto the bolt. CSK is short for countersunk bolt, so it is a bolt, but as you can see, one end is countersunk, so it's got like a chamfer. It just allows the bolt head to be hidden into the material, so there's nothing sticking out, so the bolt head does not stick out from the plate. HSFG bolts, or high strength friction grip bolts, they are quite often black and they are normally much more expensive than typical bolts. The reason behind that is because they are manufactured in a way where they have a lot of stress within them until they are properly tightened. So only by tightening up the bolts, the stress gets relieved, and therefore they carry much more weight and load than a typical bolt. It is very important to note that one of the washers for an HSFG set has these kind of bits sticking out, and you have to tighten the nut until those parts sticking out get flattened. That is when we know that the strength inside the bolt is exactly as designed. A threaded bar, studding or stud, is basically a bar that has a thread throughout the length of it. It is often used as anchor bolts or for double beams when we want to connect 2 beams to each other that are some distance apart from each other. Hilti is the name of a manufacturer of high quality fixings, so on your drawings or for quoting purposes you might see a description saying that Hilti bolts are required or Hilti anchors and so on, but whenever there's the word Hilti, it means that this manufacturer is recommended as a supplier for the fixings. A resin anchor is a stud so threaded bar, used to hold normally the base plate of a column or post, and it is embedded into concrete, but the only way to fix it to concrete is to use a resin glue that bonds the concrete and the stud inside it. So if we have anything being anchored into concrete, it most probably will be a resin anchor. Chemfix is the name of a manufacturer who does a wide range of resin or glues. They're normally two-part glues, so they get mixed up once you press the gun, and it mixes itself going through a nozzle, and then once the mixture is ready, it dries out and bonds the stud into the concrete slab. A tapped hole is a hole with a thread inside. Normally it is not used in structural steel, but sometimes if there's no access to, let's say, tighten a nut, instead of leaving it that way, you would have a tapped hole so that you could screw the bolt straight into the hole without having to have access from the back for the nut. A service hole is a normally larger hole in a steel beam. Here on the photo you can see it going not only through a steel beam but also through some timbers. They are normally up to 100 millimeters in diameter, and they should be drilled in the middle of the beam because that is where the stress loads are the smallest. A notch in steel is normally a cutout, and it's like shown here with the arrow. It's normally to allow for a connection into another beam. A slot or a slotted hole is basically an oval hole where it gives some allowance to how accurate the bolt can be. So it gives you some play. You can go up, down, left, right. And the way they're manufactured is either they are punched as a slot all in one go. It could be machined, so you have a drill going in one end and then making its way through the material and then coming out leaves you a slotted hole. Or the old way or manual way of doing it is drilling two holes, one on each side or the end of the slotted hole, and then just cutting out the material in between. Bearing, when it comes to steelwork, bearing normally means the fact that steelwork is lying on something. So let's say here on the photo we could say that this beam has a 200 millimeter bearing on the brickwork. So it means it lies 200 millimeter onto this brick pier. A pre-cambered beam is a beam that is cambered. So in other words, it is either rolled very slightly, so it could be that's over 5 meters, it is only goes out by 20 millimeters or so. The other way, instead of having it rolled all the way, you just might have it like bent in the middle. So the machine is different then, because instead of going through rollers, it just goes through a hydraulic machine that just basically puts a lot of force into the middle of the beam. A hit and miss weld is a weld like shown here, where there's a bit of hit and then there's a big gap, which is called the miss, and then again there's the hit, which is the weld, and then a gap, which is the miss. A continuous weld would be if we had these two pieces, so the beam and the bottom plate, welded but continuously, so all the way for the full length of the beam there would be a weld, and it would be from both sides as shown on the arrow. The downside is that the heat would unfortunately bend the beam and it will basically end up looking like a banana. A full weld is a weld that is fully continuous, so there are no gaps in between. And a butt weld is when there are two items being joined together head to head. So basically you would have a small gap, so normally it's around 1 or 2 millimeters, and then you would have a full weld going right through it, and that is a proper weld that sort of replaces the base material. So it is as if there was no joint whatsoever. A fillet weld is when there's a weld between two surfaces that are vertical to each other. So like on the drawing on the right hand side, even though the plates are lying on top of each other, parallel to each other, actually the back of the top plate is vertical to the bottom plate surface. Straps are normally galvanized straps of material. They are around 30 millimeter wide, normally 3 or 4 millimeters thick. They have plenty of holes. You can bend them in your hands. So basically you can form whatever shape you want, and they are quite often used to fix steel columns to existing brickwork. So you basically attach one side and then strap it around the beam and then attach the other side to the wall. Thank you very much. If you would like to follow us, then please connect on these platforms. Thank you.